everybody, this is Miss Emily with ebnmusic.com. I teach piano and voice lessons to young beginners, and I help you, the parent, give you the tools you need to help your child at home. In these next few videos, we're going to talk about everything bass clef. I call him Mr. Bass Clef, and a lot of students just call him Sad Face. I hope that when you're finished watching this video and the other ones, you'll realize how important Mr. Bass Clef is to everything music. In this video, we're going to answer who, what, why, when, how, all of those questions all about Mr. Bass Clef. So are you ready? Let's go. So bass clef, or the F clef, is a musical symbol that shows us where certain notes are. You might already be familiar with Miss Treble Clef, another musical symbol. While Miss Treble Clef represents the higher pitched notes, Mr. Bass Clef represents the lower pitched notes. They're usually put like this. Miss Treble Clef is on the top and Mr. Bass Clef at the bottom. Now, when you play piano, specifically Mr. Bass Clef, when we see him, it means we're supposed to play with our left hand. Why, you may ask? Because our left hand is closer to the lower end of the piano. You might also notice that Mr. Bass Clef looks like half of a heart. He's an incomplete heart. So for the month of February, sometimes I like to focus on Mr. Bass Clef because for the month of February, our goal is to complete his heart. His name is also Papa F, or really the F clef. But why is that? This is because Papa F, or bass clef, was originally written as just an F on the staff. Over the years, the symbol has morphed into kind of what we see today. Now, why did they choose the letter F to represent this clef? Well, the F, Mr. Bass Clef, shows us exactly where F is on the staff. Do you see Papa F's two dots? There is a line on the staff that goes right in between his two dots. And guess what that note is? That is F. So Mr. Bass Clef shows us exactly where F is. There are some instruments that read only in Mr. Bass Clef. So instruments like the tuba, the bassoon, the double basses, and even the lower male voices in a choir read in Mr. Bass Clef. Okay, so that is the who. Who is Mr. Bass Clef? So now let's answer what. What are the notes that he represents? Let's talk about that now. Today, I'm going to show you just the classic way of how most people have learned the note names in Mr. Bass Clef. However, I will say in my studio, I teach this a little bit differently, and in my classes and my courses, I teach it a little differently, but I want to teach you the classic way because it is classic for a reason. It works. Just like Miss Treble Clef, his clef has 5 lines and 4 spaces. There are definitely notes that lie above and below the staff, but for the notes within the staff, you have the line notes, which are good burritos don't fall apart, and the space notes, all cows eat grass. You also have B's the boss sitting on top, and you've got middle C, which are 2 of the other notes that we often learn first. A lot of times it helps students in learning the notes if we turn it over. So regular music is written like this, right? But if we turn it over where Mr. Bass Clef is on the top, this way they are reading the letters from left to right rather than down to up, because students are used to learning how to read. We read left to right, and so that is how they are used to reading, and sometimes that's a little easier. And then there's some of the letters written there. So this is really nice to help them because when we move it this way, they are often able to transmit or translate that knowledge to this way. So on the piano, here is middle C. Middle C and everything below that with your left hand is represented by Mr. Bass Clef. Like that. And then Miss Treble Clef is middle C and anything higher. Like that. So we've answered who Mr. Bass Clef is, what his notes are, and so now let's talk about where he is located. Mr. Bass Clef is always written below Miss Treble Clef on the grand staff, indicating that his notes are lower than Miss Treble Clef, and they're on the left side of the piano. And when you practice drawing Mr. Bass Clef, you always want to be sure that his 2 dots surround that second line. So his 2 dots are always located in that spot. Some students, as I said before, compare him to a sad face or Sometimes I use this as his bow tie. That's not a very good bow tie. I'm a terrible drawer. But no matter how you remember it or what you think they are, the placement is important to learn because it's what helps us read music better and helps us to identify all of those notes. So placing him in the right position is important. So that's where he is. Okay, so we've answered who is Mr. Bass Clef, what are his notes, where is Mr. Bass Clef located, and number 4, when do we use him? When is he useful? So practically without bass clef notes, songs just sound incomplete. So let's take the song How Far I'll Go from Moana as an example. See the line where the sky meets the sea, it calls me, and no one knows how far it goes. So there's the melody just in Miss Treble Clef. The melody's fine, but something's missing, right? When I added my left hand or the bass clef notes, you're gonna notice it's a little bit more rounded sound. So let's listen. See the line where the sky meets the sea, it calls me, and no one knows how far it goes. So now it added a little more depth to the song and added a good solid foundation. It's much more complete and enjoyable to listen to with Mr. Bass Clef. Even before learning note names and where they are on the staff, I encourage students to use bass clef in piano as soon as possible. Sometimes we learn something called pop chords, which are left-hand notes that make any song just sound more complete. So when we're learning something very simple like Mary Had a Little Lamb, there's the melody, which some students are just fine learning, but when I teach them how to incorporate Mr. Bass Clef, ooh, now it sounds more complete. Who is Mr. Bass Clef? What are his notes? Where is he located? And when does he come in handy? So now let's talk about why. Why Mr. Bass Clef? Why does he exist? I'm sure that we can come up with many reasons Mr. Bass Clef exists, but one of the reasons is one I just talked about. He really helps to round out the sound of our music. If all we played was our right hand Miss Treble Clef, our songs would just be boring and not be interesting. He really helps to complete the triangle of sound, where you have a foundation that's big and bold, and you have a top that's small but mighty. Another reason Mr. Bass Clef exists is because some instruments require the use of both clefs, the higher pitches and the lower pitches. A lot of instruments just use Miss Treble Clef, so think the flute, the clarinet, the trumpet, the soprano sax, the alto sax. They only use one clef. Some instruments only use Mr. Bass Clef. We've talked about it before, but some instruments require both. Piano is one of those instruments that uses both treble and bass clef, but other ones include the organ, the marimba, and the harp. So if Mr. Bass Clef didn't exist, those instruments would only be used half of their capacity. We wouldn't be utilizing all that there could be with those instruments. Okay, the last question is how? How would I incorporate Mr. Bass Clef in my playing if I don't know how to read his notes? I've only sung in treble clef. I've only played a treble clef instrument. Well, here is how. So here we are at the piano. So we're gonna incorporate some bass clef. We're gonna use our left hand and we're going to find a C chord, and I'm gonna teach you the C chord, an easier version of the C chord. So our pop chords that we're gonna use, so the C chord, your pinky is gonna be on that C. Then we're gonna use the A, then the F, and the G. And notice I just have my fingers 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. They're just placed on each individual key. Now with children, with young students, this will not happen right away. So we're often just playing one key. So if you like to just play one key, you can play the C, A, F, G, C, A. See there? So we're already making a song, right? So you can incorporate those 4 chords, the C, A, F, G, and then back to C. So for instance, if you know a simple song like Mary Had a Little Lamb, okay? A lot of us know that one on the piano. So you can start with the C, Now, when you change your notes, like if you change the sound, let's experiment with a different chord and let's see what it sounds like. The A sounds kind of weird, right? That G chord sounded good there. So that's ear-based training. You can kind of decide which chord sounds good just using your ear. And there you go. You have added some extra things in your song, and that's a good way to incorporate Mr. Bass Clef. All right, so there you go. So let's review what we talked about. So who is Mr. Bass Clef? He is a musical symbol that looks like a smiley face or half of a heart. That represents the lower pitched sounds. What are the notes of Mr. Bass Clef? We talked about them. You've got good burritos don't fall apart, and all cows eat grass. B's the boss sitting on top, and C with the cat whisker. Where is Mr. Bass Clef located? He is located at the bottom of the grand staff below Miss Treble Clef, and his 2 dots surround the second line. When can I use Mr. Bass Clef? Use him to round out your sound in all of your songs on the piano. Why does Mr. Bass Clef exist? He exists to round out the sound and also to incorporate all of the areas of the instruments that use both treble and bass clef, and also the instruments that use only Mr. Bass Clef. And lastly, how can I use Mr. Bass Clef? Check out just a few minutes ago where I demonstrated ways that you can use him in your own playing. Okay, so what do you think? Did you enjoy our intro to Mr. Bass Clef? Do you have any questions? Have you ever wondered about Mr. Bass Clef? Is your child in piano lessons and just struggling with bass clef? It happens. Comment below and tell me what your favorite part of this video was, and if you would like to learn something new about him, or if you have any questions at all. Next week, we're going to talk about some really cool bass chords or bass lines in pop songs, and it's going to make you think like, wow, Mr. Bass Clef is really cool. So until then, goodbye to you. See you next time. Something was missing. My left hand, bass clef. Goodbye to you. See you next time. See, it sounded so much better. Bye.